Hi, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining today's HoUSed call, National House Campaign Call for Universal Stable Affordable Housing. We're going to give it just a minute or two to allow others to join the call, but thank you so very much for attending. Hi, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining today's National House Campaign Call. We're going to just give it a few more minutes to allow others to join, but thank you so very much for coming early. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's National House Campaign Call. We're going to give it just about another minute, but we will start very, very shortly. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's National House Campaign Call. We're going to give it about 30 more seconds or so, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining today's National House Campaign Call for Universal Stable Affordable Housing. My name is Renee Willis, Senior Vice President for Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. So on today's call, we will discuss the current state of the FY 2022 spending bill and the importance of quickly enacting the bill with the highest possible funding for affordable housing, as well as protecting critical housing investments in any budget reconciliation bill. We'll be joined today by Whitney, Ergood, Obriki, and Sophia Whedon from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies to share findings from their recent report on how families change their spending strategies to afford rent during the pandemic. We'll also share an analysis from the Erase Project team on new emergency rental assistance program spending data. And we'll receive our updates as usual from the field team, or from the field, I should say. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll make the webinar available after the broadcast. You'll be able to find the recording on our website, which is www.nlihc.org. And as time permits, we'll take a few questions. And if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. So let's go ahead and get started with our first speaker, Sarah Sadian with the Coalition. Sarah is the Senior Vice President of Policy, and Sarah is going to provide the latest updates from Capitol Hill, specifically as it relates to the fiscal year 2022 spending bill and budget updates. Hello, Sarah.
Hey, Renee.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I want to start with the Build Back Better Act and the President's State of the Union address, which was last week. I know that in advance of that address, we talked to you about how we would be paying very close attention to how the President spoke about Build Back Better in terms of the timing and the path forward. What does that mean for housing? And so I want to share with you some of what I see as really big takeaways from the State of the Union and what that means for us going forward. The first takeaway is that we saw pretty much a major shift, I think, in how the President is talking about Build Back Better or about those sorts of investments. You saw that he really centered his focus on helping families meet their needs and especially lowering costs in light of inflation. And in that way, it seems like maybe President Biden is either trying to directly respond to Senator Manchin, who has repeatedly expressed concern about inflation and who has said that we need to address inflation before taking up Build Back Better. But I also think that President Biden is very likely looking ahead to the midterms and trying to help shape the narrative that Democrats will be using at that time. The second thing that I noticed in the State of the Union is that he didn't really mention Build Back Better specifically or budget reconciliation as a process. Instead, the President focused on specific priorities, which happened to be in Build Back Better. So he spoke about healthcare and childcare and climate change, et cetera, but he never said the words Build Back Better. And in fact, he shifted now to saying that those elements are part of his agenda to, quote, build a better America, just sort of like a 2.0 version of Build Back Better. So I think we're going to see still a focus on a lot of the different investments that were in Build Back Better, hopefully including housing, but a very different framework, one that's related to inflation and that one's that's not really tied to that specific bill and some of the baggage maybe that comes from that. I will say that we were really pleased to see that President Biden spoke specifically about the need for housing investments, again, relating it to issues around inflation. He specifically mentioned that too many families are living paycheck to paycheck because of rising housing costs. And he pointed out that his plan included affordable housing investments. I think that gives us an opening if there are renewed conversations about advancing a scaled back version of Build Back Better or a budget reconciliation bill. That gives us an opening to make the case for housing investments because they would directly address those concerns about inflation. I think we're still, though, continuing to get maybe some mixed messages from Senator Manchin about his support for a budget reconciliation bill. I guess that's not surprising because we've seen a lot of changes from him over the last several months. But after the State of the Union, he has said that there are no formal talks that are happening, and again reiterated his concern about inflation and the need to get America's financial situation taken care of before passing Build Back Better. But at the same time, he also sort of renewed hopes among Democrats by seemingly giving a counteroffer to Build Back Better of something that he would be able to support. So Senator Manchin spoke to reporters and said that he would be open to a package that includes raising revenues by increasing taxes on top earners or corporations, raising net revenues by allowing the federal government to negotiate for drug prices, and then splitting whatever money that can raise between deficit reduction and other priorities in Build Back Better, like climate change. So there's a small opening where we could see Build Back Better or a scaled back version of Build Back Better, to put it better. We could see that move forward. We did hear from Congressional Progressive Caucus Chair Jayapal saying that progressives would be on board with this and they'd be willing to work within this new framework if it meant that Senator Manchin would vote for a final package. We've also heard from Representative Clyburn, who's a part of the Democratic leadership in the House, that he's optimistic about the chances of reviving talks. And so, we'll see how that goes, but I think that means that we really need to be continuing to pay attention to Build Back Better, very still focused on our top priorities for the bill, which include $25 billion for rental assistance, $65 billion for public housing, and $15 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. It's clear that if this framework that Manchin has offered, if that is the bill that moves forward or the framework that moves forward, it means that there really won't be a ton of money left over for other priorities, and that there will be a lot of competition, frankly, between childcare, healthcare, housing, climate change, all of the different priorities that Democrats wanted in Build Back Better, and they'll have to make tough choices about what gets into this final package. So I think it's important for us to keep engaging with members of Congress, especially Democrats in the House and Senate, and to urge them to keep the historic investments that were in Build Back Better for housing, specifically around rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund, and any sort of deal that moves forward. We did create a new fact sheet, and I'm going to share it with you in the chat box now. Let me just see. There we go. Outlining why these housing investments would directly tackle inflation. I think this might be an important resource for all of you guys as we go forward, if we know that part of this framing that Manchin has been using is about inflation too. So now I'll move on to appropriations. We know that it seems like congressional appropriators are close to releasing a final spending package for FY22. Maybe it could be released as soon as tomorrow. It sounds like they are working very hard over the weekend to try to get things squared away. There might not yet be an agreement when it comes to some pieces of the bill, like additional funding assistance for Ukraine and extra COVID relief funds, disaster supplemental dollars for recent hurricanes Ida, Laura, and Delta. But it sounds like they have made significant progress and that we could see something soon. As you know, Congress is under a really tight timeline for trying to either pass the final spending bill or to pass another continuing resolution to keep the government open, or else we would see a government shutdown. It doesn't sound like anybody is expecting a government shutdown, but they are certainly working right against the deadline, which is this Friday when the current continuing resolution expires. The House and Senate are the Democrats in the House and Senate are supposed to go on their retreats for the latter part of this week. But we've already heard that House members specifically could be called back to take a vote on the final spending bill if needed. So they might have to make some plans, change some plans to make sure. We've also heard that it's possible that maybe they don't get it done by this week, by this Friday at the deadline, and they might need one other continuing resolution for a very short period of time so that they can get the spending bills over the finish line. You might remember that we've talked about how the House proposal for the spending bill includes a major expansion of rental assistance to another 125,000 households. We assume they're very close to bill language, so there's you might, if you're able to, make one last push to call your members of Congress. This includes both Democrats and Republicans in support of the House proposal to expand vouchers. Until we really see bill text, we want to keep that pressure up to make sure that we get as much housing resources as possible. And then finally, I wanted to talk with all of you guys about some other pieces to the House campaign policy agenda. As you guys know, the House campaign is focused on advancing anti-racist policy reforms and achieving the large-scale investments that we need to make sure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. We've long focused on 4 major solutions, each of which would be paired with needed reforms as well, but we've focused on how do we bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs, how do we increase the supply of affordable rental homes for people with the lowest incomes, how do we provide emergency rental assistance to help stabilize families in a crisis, and strengthening and enforcing renter protections. And we'll talk more about the full scope of this agenda next week and some of the bills that we'll be working on, how we can help achieve many of these goals this year and next. But for now, I want to share with you an updated list of the legislation that the campaign has endorsed. I'm sharing that in the chat box right now. And I want to call out specifically a bill that we've worked on that I think is going to be a lot of interest to you guys, and to ask for your help in building congressional support for it. I'm talking about the Eviction Crisis Act, which is S2182. It was introduced by a bipartisan team of senators, including Senator Bennett from Colorado, Portman from Ohio, Brown from Ohio, and Young from Indiana. The bill was originally introduced in 2019, and it called for an emergency housing stabilization fund to provide short-term assistance to households that were at risk of eviction. You know, this bill was introduced before the pandemic, and I think we've learned that there's a lot of value in this, and it was pretty forward-thinking in terms of what we would need during the pandemic as well. So they've reintroduced the bill. They've made some important changes to it. I just want to call out one. The bill now creates a permanent emergency rental assistance program at about $3 billion annually. Originally in 2019, when we designed the bill with them, we were thinking about a much smaller program where we would, learn a lot more about what works with ERA, what doesn't work, what are some best practices, with the goal of taking that information and scaling up a program over time. But of course, with the pandemic and with the $46 billion that we've seen in emergency rental assistance dollars, we've already learned a lot about how ERA works or doesn't work. And our congressional champions really looked at that ERA program at Treasury as proving what the value is of a program like this. And so we've all shifted gears to make this a permanent program going on. There were some other changes that were made to make it more similar to Treasury's ERA program and to incorporate some best practices and lessons learned, including lessons around using self-attestation and direct-to-tenant assistance and other things that you've heard about on our national calls. Our hope is that by passing the Eviction Crisis Act and the permanent ERA program, is that it would allow ERA program administrators who've spent the last year building up this infrastructure to keep it in place so that the next time there is a crisis, there's already an existing program that we can tap into, rather than asking state and local governments to set up brand new programs from the start. And the bill is supported by a really broad array of organizations, not just folks who work in housing. And so I want to call out a couple of others who I think are really interesting that they've come to the table in support of the bill. That includes Children's Health Watch, the NAACP, the National Association of Social Workers, the National Education Association, National League of Cities, and the Food Research and Action Center. Again, really showing that this issue about stabilizing households in a crisis is one that has impacts well beyond just housing, and there's a lot of interest in that. So I want to just encourage folks that to be engaging on this bill as well. It would be great if you could ask your senators, especially Republican senators, to co-sponsor the bill. I guess, again, it's S2182. And we'll share some more information with a fact sheet on the bill. I'm going to share that in the chat box as well. But this is a place where we can be moving our advocacy forward. I know that many of you have focused on the ERA program in your community, and this would be a good place for making that sort of a program permanent going forward. And with that, I will turn it back to Renee.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's see. So we did have one question that came in, and I just to make sure that everyone is checking the Q&A box. That is certainly where you can ask questions of any of our speakers, but we did have a question that came in that Elena, thank you very much, has answered. But the question is, what is the name of the proposed bill? And I just want to make sure that people saw this, but the name of the proposed bill is the Eviction Crisis Act. So take a look again in the Q&A box, and you'll see a link there to that particular bill.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. And I just want, before I go, I just want to remind folks, I know a lot of you guys might be seeing ERA money run out in your communities, or programs have had to be put on hold because they need more emergency rental assistance dollars. We know that the Treasury ERA program was never really designed to be a permanent long-term solution. It was meant to respond to the crisis in the moment because of the pandemic. But this is really something where if we had this in place, it could be providing a lot of benefit to folks outside of the pandemic. It's a long-term solution. I know that many of you guys have been focused on that.
So a question that came in, so let's see. The question is, the Eviction Crisis Act is currently SB 2182, correct? Is that, okay. So yes, thank you for that question. And here's another question. What were your 3 bullets? Rental assistance, housing trust.
Sure, so I think this is referring to the 3 priorities that we've been pushing for with Build Back Better. Those include $25 billion for rental assistance, which would expand the program to an additional 300,000 households, $65 billion for public housing to preserve those units for about 2.5 million current residents, but also for future generations living in public housing, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund, which we estimate would either build or preserve about 150,000 homes that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes.
Perfect, thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, and I think that is it in terms of for the questions. And also do take a look at the chat. There's a lot of activity happening in chat. So certainly take a look at that. There are links there to a lot of the information that Sarah just spoke about. Okay, so I think that's it, Sarah. Thank you so very much for those important updates. We're going to move now to our next speaker. So I would like for our next speakers to come on. So we have Whitney Ergood Obriki and Sophia Whedon from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. And they will share findings from a report on household spending strategies during the COVID-19 pandemic. Whitney and Sophia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Okay, good. Those are my slides. Awesome. So my name is Sophia Whedon, and I'm a research assistant at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. First, I just wanted to thank everyone for being here today and for inviting me to speak. And today I'm going to be sharing some findings from a recently published research brief, which is about renter household spending strategies during the pandemic. This paper was written with Whitney Ergood Obriki, who is on the call today, as well as our Joint Center colleagues, Chris Herbert and Alex Herman. So I want to point out very quickly that this work is being done as part of the Housing Crisis Research Collaborative. The collaborative was started in response to the pandemic, and it's a joint effort across those 4 research centers listed at the bottom of your screen to study the impacts of the pandemic on housing and affordability. And the motivation for the research that I'll be sharing today came from a different paper that we published with the collaborative in early 2021, which is called Renters' Responses to Financial Stress. It's the one on the left. So in that paper, we reviewed evidence from a number of studies trying to get a sense of how the pandemic was impacting renters and their finances. We looked at different estimates of rent arrearages, as well as the differential impacts by race and ethnicity, income, age, and other household characteristics. And one of our findings from that work was that renters were responding to financial stress of lost income by tapping a very wide range of financial resources. And that includes their own personal financial resources like savings and credit cards and borrowing. And it also includes a lot of public programs like unemployment insurance and stimulus payments. And we concluded from that work that just looking at the number or share of households behind on rent would ultimately underestimate the full financial impact of the pandemic on households. The paper that I'll be discussing today, Making the Rent, is intended to fill those information gaps. The financial impact of the pandemic went way beyond what rent arrearages might suggest, so we need to also examine the resources that renters are turning to pay the bills. So this paper uses the Household Pulse Survey to address 3 questions. First of all, we wanted to understand the extent to which renters who lost income are relying on different resources, including their own personal financial resources, as well as policy programs to cover their expenses. Second, we want to test the association between using those resources and falling behind on rent. And third, we wanted to understand how resource use varied by household demographic characteristics, including income and race and ethnicity. So the primary data source, which you see on your screen, is the Household Pulse Survey. This survey was launched by the Census Bureau in April 2020, and its purpose is to track the ongoing economic and social and health impacts of the pandemic on US households. The Household Pulse Survey generally collected data every 2 weeks during our study period, each week with an independently drawn sample. And so we aggregated data from the Pulse from August 2020 to March 2021. And that left us with a sample of around 234,000 renter households, including around 113,000 that lost employment income. And on this slide, you can see the key indicators that we looked at. So the Pulse asks respondents if they've lost income at some point since the start of the pandemic. It also asks renters whether they're caught up on their rent or not. And it asks about the financial resources that households have been using to manage their expenses in the past week. Next slide. So now let's talk about some findings. The first and maybe the most important point that I want to highlight is that whether households lost income during the pandemic or not, most of them were still making rent. So in this chart, the bar on the left is showing households that did not lose income. And we see from this that the vast majority of these households continued to pay rent, and only about 9% fell behind. Now, the bar on the right is showing households that lost income. And this is a group that we really want to focus on too. Households that lost income were around 3 times as likely to fall behind on rent as the households that didn't lose income. And yet, at the same time, the majority of these households, like 76% of these households, were still making rent, which means that one way or another, most of these households are compensating for that financial shock with other resources. So as we continue to think about estimating the full financial impact of COVID on renters, we're going to focus on both of those groups and the resources that they're using to pay the bills. Next slide. So this chart is showing the extent to which renter households relied on different resources to meet their spending needs. The blue bars here are showing households that did not lose income during the pandemic, and the orange bars represent households that lost income. This chart is measuring the share of households that used each resource in the past week, and households can select as many categories as apply. So not very surprisingly, we found that households that lost income were much less likely to rely on regular income sources. But as a consequence of not having as much income available to them, the households that lost income were much more likely to rely on every other financial resource. So these households were more likely to pay for expenses using credit cards. They were more likely to use their personal savings, more likely to borrow from friends and family. And they were also more likely to use policy supports like unemployment insurance, stimulus checks, and SNAP benefits at much higher rates. Next slide. Now, the ability to tap those other financial resources is clearly very important in helping renters fall behind on rent. And we know this because only about a quarter of those that lost income actually fell behind on rent at the time of the survey. So in this chart, the sample is limited only to the just over half of renter households that lost income. The blue bars here represent the households who were not behind on rent. Oh, I think that's, that's mislabeled. It should be not behind on rent. The orange bars are households that are behind on rent. And what we see from this is that the households that were caught up on rent are much more likely and more able to draw from their own personal financial resources, such as credit cards and savings. But for those who are behind on rent, though, they had less income and less formal resources to rely on. More than half of households who fell behind on rent reported borrowing from friends or family. Borrowing from friends and family was the most common support for these households, and a higher share reported borrowing than reported using any other resource. And these households were also a lot more likely than households who are caught up on rent to report using SNAP to pay for their expenses. Next slide. So this chart is showing resource use among households behind on rent. And it's broken down by income. So we can see the share of households at each income level that are using each resource. And the major takeaway here from this chart is that higher income households tend to have more resources available to them. So even when they fall behind on rent, they're more able to rely on their own financial resources. So we can see from this chart that the rate at which households are using things like regular income, credit cards, and savings increases along with income. But lower income households are much more likely to borrow and much more likely to use SNAP. The difference in SNAP use isn't terribly surprising because it has eligibility requirements that are based on income. But the fact that it's the most commonly used resource among these very low income households, or the second most commonly used resource among these very low income households, points to the fact that these households really had very few resources to turn to, so SNAP was an important support for them. Next slide. Now, this chart is showing the trends by race and ethnicity, which in some ways are kind of similar to the trends by income. So Black and Hispanic households in particular have lower incomes on average, resulting from decades of discrimination in the labor market and in education. Given this overlap in race and ethnicity and income, the spending strategies that Black and Hispanic renter households used in some ways looked pretty similar to the strategies used by lower income households. Hispanic, Black, and Asian households were less likely than white households to rely on regular income or savings. And the rates of credit card use and use of savings were particularly low for Black households. Next slide. Now, the descriptive statistics that I've presented so far are pretty useful in illustrating differences in spending behavior. But at the same time, there are pretty substantial demographic differences between households that might influence both the use of different resources and the likelihood of falling behind on rent. The purpose of this model that I'm presenting is to test the independent association of the use of different resources on the likelihood that a household falls behind on rent. So in this chart, the x-axis is measuring odds ratios. An odds ratio greater of 1 means there's no independent association between use of a resource and the likelihood of falling behind on rent. A ratio greater than 1 means that the resource is more associated with a missed rent payment, and a ratio less than 1 means the characteristic is less associated with a missed rent payment. And this model essentially confirms the financial strategies highlighted in the earlier cost tabulations. Using regular income significantly reduced the likelihood of missing rent by nearly half. And savings and assets also provided a buffer for households who lost income and reduced the odds of missing rent by around 16%. Borrowing from friends and family, on the other hand, was associated with twice the likelihood of being behind on rent, likely reflecting having fewer resources to pull from. SNAP benefits were also associated with a higher likelihood of missing rent, and maybe compensating for some financial shortfalls on the behalf of households. Next slide. So there are a couple important conclusions from this study, and here are a couple that I would really like to highlight. So first of all, these findings point to the importance of the ongoing federal aid for households who've taken a financial hit. So federal aid, including SNAP and unemployment insurance, longstanding programs, remain really critical pillars of support, and stimulus payments seem to be widely used too. And these supports are important for all households, but especially for lowest income households. At the same time, we also know that extremely low income households who receive those public supports still tapped their own very limited personal financial resources. And they also still borrow from friends and family, which suggests that those federal programs by themselves may not be fully meeting the needs of those lowest income households, or that they aren't reaching them. And finally, low-income households who took a financial hit were much more likely to borrow from friends and family. This points to the radiating of the financial impacts of the pandemic beyond those directly impacted. The financial hit isn't just impacting extremely low-income households who fall behind, but it's likely that it's impacting their social networks and their communities too. And that's another way that the financial costs of the pandemic may be underestimated. So this is a snapshot of our paper. I encourage you to visit our website, which I think Whitney might have linked in the chat, and I'll open things up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So we do have two questions. The first one is from Julio from Hudson River Housing. And Julio wants to know what percentage of the households that lost income were minority groups?
Yeah, so let me just pull up some extra slides. So during the study period, let me take a look. So 55% of Black renter households lost income during the study period, as did 63% of Hispanic households and 46% of Asian households. Compare that with 48% of white renter households.
Great, thanks, Sophia. And another question from Carrie. What impact did the existence of the eviction moratoriums have on means used to make rent? It seems like there would be increased desperation more means tried in areas with no moratoriums versus those with additional legal security.
Well, so we didn't break this down by geography. That's actually something we're doing in a third iteration of this paper, release date TBD. But we're going to be doing some looking at, I guess, smaller geographies. But we didn't look at the impact of eviction moratorium or the impact of an eviction moratoria. Although I will say, I mean, it's pretty clear that I mean, a lot of these households, when they're borrowing at really high rates and using their own income, their own savings at very low rates, it seems kind of inevitable that they are going to be at sort of increased risk when the eviction moratoria go away, especially if emergency rental assistance isn't reaching them.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. Could you say anything about the impact of ERA on the financial health of renters?
Well, so this study period was from March 2020 to, or no, what was it? It was from August 2020 to March 2021. So this was before emergency rental assistance started getting out. That's something that the Household Pulse Survey has subsequently started asking about. So it might be fodder for a follow-up paper. But I think our findings kind of point to why one of the many reasons that emergency rental assistance would be critical. Particularly because these low-income households who have lost income or behind on rent are pulling from a lot of different resources, and especially borrowing from friends and family, which suggests that they might not have large amounts. I mean, not that they had them to begin with. If they're lower income households, they probably didn't. They probably don't have very significant financial resources of their own to pull from, and they've probably drawn down a lot of that anyway, trying to pay rent over the past couple of months. So we don't know exactly what the impact of the emergency rental assistance has been once it's gotten out. I think this study is more about demonstrating the need for programs like that, and also kind of the devastating financial impact that not having, that these households are experiencing when they clearly are depleting their own personal resources and don't have, I guess are in need of more cash assistance.
Great. And we have one or two more questions. And I may ask you if you have time to stick with us, maybe to answer these when we go on to our next speaker. But here is a question. It says, when do you think the inflation will catch up with SNAP benefits and other low-income programming?
I don't know.
Okay. And let me see if I can sneak one more quick question in there. We have a viewer who is wondering if the analysis is possible at the level of individual states.
Yeah, so we're looking into that. I think that's going to be the third edition of this paper, getting at lower levels of geography. We're also hoping to do some neighborhood level analysis. So keep an eye out for that in the next half a year.
Perfect. Thank you so very much, Sophia. And thank you as well, Whitney. We really do appreciate you being with us on this call and sharing the report. And as Sophia mentioned, Whitney did drop a link to the report in the chat. So please do take a look at the report. And again, thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you so much to everyone who is listening, and thank you for inviting us.
Indeed. All right, so let's now transition to our next speaker and topic. So we have Sophie Glover, from the coalition. And so Sophie is going to provide an update on the latest ERA spending and demographics data. So welcome, Sophie.
Thanks, Renee, and hello, everybody. As Renee mentioned, my name is Sophie Seebach-Glover, and I'm a research specialist with the Emergency Rental Assistance Research Team here at NLIHC. Next slide. The U.S. Department of the Treasury recently released updated Emergency Rental Assistance Program spending data through December 31st, 2021, as well as released demographic data for the first year of emergency rental assistance. For those interested in looking through the data, I will drop these links into the chat at the end of the update. Next slide. Between January 2021 and December 2021, $18.5 billion from ERA 1 and ERA 2 has been dispersed, reaching over 3.2 million renter households. In December, grantees dispersed $1.1 billion in ERA 1 funds, which brings the total ERA 1 spent or obligated to $17.6 billion. This is about 70% of ERA 1 funds allocated. Grantees dispersed $1.3 billion of ERA 2 in December, which brings the total ERA 2 spent or obligated to $5.8 billion, or about 27% of ERA 2 funds allocated. Next slide. As seen here, ERA 1 spending, represented by the yellow line, rapidly increased between May and August 2021 and peaked in September 2021. Since September, ERA 1 spending has continued to decline, and in December reached the lowest amount spent since May 2021. Conversely, very little ERA 2, which is represented by the blue line, was spent between July and September 2021, but sharply increased between September and November. ERA 2 spending also dropped to $1.33 billion in December, just slightly down from $1.38 billion in November. This spending pattern is likely indicative that many slow spending grantees are continuing to slowly spend their ERA 1, while fast spending grantees have exhausted their ERA 1 allocation and have fully transitioned to spending their ERA 2 allocation. Next slide. The December spending data continues to show uneven spending performance across grantees. 8 state grantees, indicated in yellow, have spent less than 15% of their initial ERA 1 allocation, with South Dakota, North Dakota, Arizona, Wyoming, and Nebraska spending less than 10% of their ERA 1 allocation by the end of December. It should be noted that several of these slow spending state grantees have reallocated a portion of their ERA 1 funds to faster spending local grantees, which may help get assistance out to households who need it. 13 state grantees, indicated in blue, have spent at least 75% of their ERA 1 funds, with California, Virginia, and New Jersey spending over 90% of their allocation. Because grantees can use at least 10% of their ERA 1 allocation on administrative costs, any grantee that has spent at least 90% of their allocation on assistance to households has likely exhausted their entire ERA 1 allocation. 3 state grantees, New Jersey, the District of Columbia, and Texas, have also spent more than 70% of their ERA 2 funds. Next slide. On average, local grantees continue to spend their funds faster than state grantees. By the end of December, local grantees spent $4.4 billion of ERA 1 funds, representing 79% of their total allocation, and $992 million of ERA 2 funds, or 19% of their total allocation. 60% of local grantees have spent more than 75% of their ERA 1 funds, while 30 local grantees have spent less than 30% of their ERA1 funds. 19 local grantees have also reported spending more than 70% of their ERA2 funds by the end of December, including San Diego, New Orleans, Harris County, Texas, Austin, Philadelphia, and Nashville. Next slide. Treasury also released additional demographic data, which provides additional insight about households that received ERA funds in 2021. Nearly 2 of every 3 households that were served by ERA1 and ERA2 funds had extremely low incomes, as indicated by the yellow portion of the pie charts. These are households who have incomes between 0 to 30% of the area median income. As seen in the blue portion of the ERA1 pie chart, 23% of households served by ERA1 had very low incomes, which are incomes that range between 30 to 50% of the area median income, and 13% of households served by ERA1 had low incomes, or between 50 to 80% of area median income. Households served by ERA2 had a very similar breakdown, with 22% of households served having very low incomes and 15% of households served having low incomes. Next slide. The demographic data released also shows that ERA funds reached a higher proportion of households of color. Around 41% of households that received ERA1 funds identified as Black, and 19% of households that received ERA1 funds identified as Hispanic. Similarly, 46% of households that received ERA2 funds identified as Black, and 23% of households identified as Hispanic. A growing body of research finds that Black and Hispanic households have a higher likelihood of COVID-19 exposure and community transmission, limited access to testing and treatment, and increased economic hardship. So it follows that these households would have a higher preponderance of being negatively impacted by COVID-19 and in need of rental assistance. Next slide. For those interested in additional ERA resources, NLIHC tracks ERA spending through the spending tracker and dashboard. Our tracking integrates Treasury data with real-time data from program dashboards and program administrators to provide a closer estimate of how much ERA funding has been obligated to date. I'll drop links to these resources in the chat. And as always, if you have any questions regarding emergency rental assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out to research, RESEARCH, at nlihc.org. And I'll turn it back to you, Renee.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Excellent report. I'm always impressed with the work that you and your team, that you guys do. I do have a question that is coming in from Patrick, and it is it's a few questions in here. So the question is, how do the ERA fund statistics take into account the checks that were counted as disbursed funds but never cashed? Second part of this question is, in my state of Florida, statistics include the sum of check register totals and not the actual funds that made it to any beneficiary. Is such the case around the country? And the last part of this, do we have any idea of the amount of unused funds that are currently considered allocated?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thanks, Patrick. I will drop a link to the Treasury reporting guidelines, which give definitions around what each data point means. And that's really what program administrators are using as they submit this data. So that might be helpful for you to answer this question. We don't have a great idea about the amount of unused funds that are currently considered allocated, but if others like Patrick are experiencing the same thing in their communities, we'd love to know and would love for you to reach out.
Thank you, Sophie. We have another question coming in from Jerry, and Jerry wants to know, is there any correlation of rates of eviction with lower levels of ERA spending?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's a bit tricky to answer. It's a bit complex because different ERA programs had different eviction restrictions tied to funds, as well as there were different eviction moratoria in different localities. But I'll drop a few links to some research, and we'll also reach out to my team to see if they have any other ideas and follow up.
Okay, great. And then the last question comes in from Megan. And Megan wants to know, is there information on how many undocumented individuals have been assisted with ERA funds?
Yeah, that's a good question. We Treasury is not collecting that information, and so it's not a part of this demographic release. I don't think that we have a great idea of how many undocumented individuals have been assisted. I know there was a lot of discussion about how to make sure that undocumented households felt comfortable applying for emergency rental assistance, but we don't have any systematic data on those numbers.
Thanks. And I know I said that was the last question, but I'm going to try and sneak one more in, if you don't mind,
Sure.
Sophie. And this question comes in from Marion, who wants to know, do you have insight on the ERA2 Treasury guidance to be released this month regarding reallocation of the 60% unreleased to jurisdictions?
Let me follow up with Marion. I'm not quite sure what that is referring to. We do know Noel Poyo from Treasury mentioned that in the coming weeks, there will be data released on the second round of reallocation, and that is the for ERA1. And then ERA2, their allocation is released in tranches. First, programs get 40% and then can get their remaining tranches after they spend a certain percent of their first ERA2 tranche. It gets a little bit complicated, but I'll follow up with Marion to make sure that I answered that question.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sophie. And again, thank you for all the great data. All right, so let's move into our field updates. So now we're going to turn to our partners in the field to hear what's happening in Pennsylvania, New York, and South Carolina. And I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis Chamberlain first of the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Phyllis. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Renee, and hi, everyone. So here at the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, we decided to obtain publicly available data on eviction filings. We know that data drives conversations about solutions. And as we start to enter a post-pandemic world, not quite there yet, but starting to enter that world, we're really interested in what strategies, both programs and policy-wise, are impacting eviction outcomes so that we can promote those strategies and policies as solutions to address the eviction crisis that existed prior to the pandemic. You can go to the next slide. What we did was look at calendar year 2021 and compared it to 2019, of course, being a pre-pandemic year. And we found a few things that were pretty interesting, but what I'm focusing on today is what I consider the most notable successes, which are two programs operating in two counties here in Pennsylvania, which are demonstrating an impact on evictions. So when we look at data, certainly we don't know whether or not a tenant was definitely displaced. So what we're looking at is a legal definition of eviction. And we're interested in whether or not there was a judgment for the defendant. So in a landlord-tenant case, that would be a tenant. And we're also interested in whether cases have been withdrawn or settled or dismissed. Two programs, one in Chester County and one in Berks County. The two programs are similar, but a little bit different. They're providing a combination of legal representation, rental assistance, and other services. And in this example in Chester County, the data shows that in the courts where this program is operating, cases are 3 times more likely to be withdrawn, and cases are 2.5 times more likely to be settled. Can you go to the next slide? What we also found is that orders of possession are down. So an order of possession is the legal term for the actual lockout, that if a case is decided for the plaintiff, which would be the landlord, there needs to be an order of possession in order to actually lock out the person. I will note that certainly there are sometimes illegal lockouts, but we also found that the orders of possessions are also down. Can you go to the next slide? So the next 2 slides show the results for Berks County, and it's similar. Cases are more likely to be withdrawn, and in this case, the judgment for the defendant is also more likely. I will note that in Berks County, the group running this program noted that tenants are much more likely to show up for the court hearing, which is really important. And I'm sure tenants are showing up for a variety of reasons, but they're contacted in advance so that they know that they have this legal representation option available, which is, unfortunately, we know not something that tenants often have access to. And go to the next slide. So same, this is the chart about the orders of possession specifically for Berks County. Can you go to the next slide? So on our website, and I'll put the link to our report in the chat, we have an interactive version of the report, and this is just one example of what we were able to provide our network because of the data that we accessed. You can go to the next slide. Then I don't know if this is true for data in other states, but there are certainly a number of limitations to the data available. One of them is that even though we requested the data, which is again publicly available, so we did a right to know request, that data doesn't actually tell us the reason for the eviction filing. But we did find that in the vast majority of cases that rent in arrears was awarded to the landlord, which has us draw the conclusion that most cases are for non-payment of rent. And go to the next slide. Then Chi-Hun Kim here at the Housing Alliance is the one who analyzed this data and put together all this great information. So for any questions, I'd encourage people to either get in touch with me or get in touch with him. But what we plan to do with this data moving forward is we do plan to update this data to continue to access it, to see what's happening and what trends there are in terms of both eviction filings and eviction outcomes. And we'll be promoting the strategies that are showing evidence that they're really impacting eviction outcomes. So thanks, Renee, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. Great report. And thank you so much for that analysis. I don't see any questions just yet from our viewers, but just a reminder to our viewers, if you do have questions, you can certainly use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But thank you so very much, Phyllis, for that wonderful report. All right, so let's now turn to our partner, Jeanette Ruffins from Homeward NYC. Jeanette, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you so much for
Oh.
joining us today.
Hi, so thank you for inviting me. My name is Jeanette Ruffins. I'm the CEO of HomeWood NYC, but today actually I'm talking to you as a member of RESH, which is the Racial Equity in Supportive Housing. So the Supportive Housing Network of New York brings together all of the supportive housing providers to talk about shared issues, and they're a strong advocacy group for us on the ground in the city and in the state. And so during, after the COVID lockdown in March, we started having like really regular meetings, right? Checking in with providers on a regular basis. And then it became clear to us, the Black and Brown leaders of color, that there were issues that were not being addressed in city policies, and also became clear to us as we were on these provider calls that, as usual, even though we serve, we have staffs of predominantly Black and Brown people, we serve predominantly Black and Brown people, we would still look around the rooms and not see ourselves as represented as we should be in those groups. And so we started what is basically a volunteer affinity group to, spotlight some of the issues that we thought of racial equity in supportive housing. And, it was perfect. Obviously, it was COVID, which was a perfect time to start addressing some issues of racial equity. And so it is volunteer. There's 6 people on the steering committee. We have about 30 active participants, but probably a list of maybe 60 or 70 to 30 people who participate on a regular basis. And let's talk a little bit about what we did. So we started really focused on COVID and making sure that information about the actual, what COVID is, what the symptoms are. And then of course, as vaccines rolled out toward the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, making sure that we had webinars where we had predominantly, Black Latinx doctors talking about it to address some of the vaccine resistance we knew and expected among our community. And some specialized one-on-one trainings for our staff, some that were open to the public, including the residents, and then also trying to organize particular vaccine events in the community. We actually, when the city was going to go to mandates, and we knew that resistance was very high in our community, we were particularly concerned that mandates were, one, going to create staffing vacancies and problems for us, but also were going to disproportionately affect, if people were not willing to get vaccinated, our community, our residents, and of course, our staff. So we wrote an op-ed on whether, to mandate or not to mandate, what the city could be doing before they mandated, which was provide a lot more information before they moved toward mandates. We also did advocacy with the city on retention bonuses. Originally, when the city had first put out retention bonuses for the city for people who had to work daily during the vaccine, they were originally were targeting like the social service staff, the direct care staff. And actually, most of us had worked out so that many of our direct care at least had a couple of days a week where they didn't have to be on site. The people who had to be on site every day were the front desk staff and the maintenance and operations staff, and they were not included in that retention bonus. So we did a lot of advocacy with the city around that. And now we are really on our big project, which is to do a 6-week, a 24-week actually, but 6-week in class on leadership development. And we have a group that's called Relish, which is Raising Emerging Leaders in Supportive Housing. And it's going to be targeted toward director levels who want to move up in supportive housing. Obviously, when we looked around and we looked at vice presidents and the C-suite, we did not see ourselves represented as much. And so we really want to look at how people progress through the system. And a lot of what happens in all of our sites probably is that if you're a social service worker, you know that particular part of your job and that particular part of the agency very well. You may or may not be exposed to some of the broader HR issues, benefits, or the financial issues putting together the agency budget. You may know your program budget. So our goal is to kind of help people see the areas that they need to grow in and then provide mentorship over this 24 weeks. And hopefully the mentorship will actually go on longer after the 24 weeks, but to have them paired with Black and Brown leaders to kind of talk about both issues in their current job, talk about their class, what they're learning in class, but more importantly, give them someone to check in with as they go through and grow professionally. So we are hoping that the mentorship actually leads to much longer term relationships. And then, like, let's say I'm in one field, but I could, if my mentor needs an introduction to somebody else, then I would be using my contacts to introduce them to somebody who could help them with particular subjects. It's really important that we expand the networks of Black and Brown people so that they, because there's a lot of truth to it's not what you know, it's who you know. And we want to expand the who you know and their professional networks also. And we are also hoping, obviously right now it's volunteer, but we are going to be trying to package that so that we can get some funding so that we can really have a paid coordinator. I think that would be able to expand this exponentially. So are there I could check the chat, are there any questions? And anybody who is interested in knowing more about it or want to talk more about it, my email. And I will say, if any of you have a lot of experience with starting mentorship programs, I would love to hear from you on that level. You can shoot me an email and then we can connect and I can try to figure out how.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jeanette. We do have a question from Jerry. Jerry wants to know, how do you see your small group growing in power, and how do you measure the effectiveness of your outreach efforts?
Well, I think, for example, I know for the Relish, the Emerging Leaders Program, it has been primarily word of mouth. But, we had set our class, we thought that we would probably start with a class of 25 because we thought we would be able to get maybe 25 mentors. Now, we already know we have a class, we could probably fill a class of 50 or 60. I don't know, we're just starting mentor outreach. I think it's such a need that we haven't had to do much outreach. I think when we get to the point where we have a paid staff member, I think right now we have more than we have the capacity to manage, but I think if we could get a paid staff or somebody on it, we could expand.
That's great. And Jerry also wants to know if there are any lessons for other communities where the disparities are equally glaring. And then he says, particularly ways of growing new leadership and social service providers. Yes.
I would say, this was really just we saw the need and we started. I would say, are there already existing groups that either have Black and Brown leaders within them, right? And start with that, and then they could reach out. Almost everybody has coalitions or belongs to coalitions. So I think, you start with one coalition and then you decide, okay, so we're the coalition of childcare providers, and then we join with the coalition of homeless service providers and the coalition of supportive housing providers. First of all, there's probably going to be some overlap because many agencies do, multiple tasks, and just come up with a group, I mean, literally, we just talked to ourselves for a while before we really opened up to the public to say, what do we want to do? But then I think it's also important that the city knows that you exist, right? Your city, your county, or whoever, that this is a group that they can talk to when they have issues or want to brainstorm, or a policy is coming out, you know, invite somebody to one of your conversations and say, listen, we just want to talk about this. We think put a little bit more thought in before you roll this out.
Absolutely. And then Jerry he's looking forward to reading your report once your work progresses. So thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Indeed.
Right.
Have a wonderful day. All right, so we're going to finish up with our last group of field presenters. So we have Bridget Brown and Bach Pham from South Carolina Appleseed, and also Pharrell Maurice Malone Jr. from Fresh Communities. The floor is yours.
Hey y'all, can everybody hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having us. My name is Bridget Brown, and I am the Deputy Director at South Carolina Appleseed Legal Justice Center here in Columbia. We are a nonprofit law firm and policy organization focused on serving the needs of low-income South Carolinians across the state. And a few weeks ago, we were on a call with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and we were able to connect with Reverend Malone and his son Maurice and their organization, Fresh Communities, out of Waycross, Georgia. So he did a presentation on that call about wanting to use what he refers to as their mobile billboard, to do a tour prior to the State of the Union in order to further promote housing provisions in the Build Back Better bill as a priority, especially across the Southeast. So in a matter of 10 days or less, we organized two events, one in Charleston, South Carolina, and one in Columbia. So we called both of those things a party with a purpose, and the goal was to get the community out, serve some really great food, and get people talking about housing priorities. So the first one we did took place in Charleston at a place called Martin's Park, which was right outside of downtown. As some of y'all may know, Charleston is one of the fastest growing places in the US, but what that has meant for their local population is that the people who have historically lived in some of these downtown neighborhoods are being pushed out because of that rapid growth. Martin Park is one of these strongholds, and honestly, it couldn't have been a better place to do this thing. It also could not have happened were it not for Reverend Malone, who put us in touch with his sister-in-law, who is the principal of an elementary school right down the street there, and also his brother, who worked super hard, like I said, in such a short amount of time in order to get us this space. So once there, we worked with Reverend Malone's extended family, also worked with the head of the park in order to get the community out and talking about housing priorities. We also were able to work with some of our partners in the food insecurity space, some of our partners who are focused on vaccinating people with the COVID vaccine. Some of our other partners in the legal realm in Charleston, came out that day. We worked with a local chef there who actually grew up right in that neighborhood. Probably had a couple hundred people come out over the course of the evening. And what you're looking at are pictures that that Bach took and that Maurice and Reverend Malone took in front of the bus, the mobile billboard. And so had a really, really great turnout. We had some incredible speakers. We had Bernie Mazik from the South Carolina Association of Community Development. We also had Reverend Bill Stanfield from Metanoia, South Carolina. These were a couple folks who we have worked with some in the past, especially Bernie Mazik, who has a long-standing history of advocacy in the affordable housing space, and both of whom are very well-known and integral parts of the Charleston community. So wonderful to work with them and to further build on those relationships. But I think the best part of the Charleston event, honestly, was the turnout from the community. Reverend Malone had just an awesome playlist going the whole time. So there was some dancing. There were lots of meals being served, which was great. Lots of kids participated, and loved what he did with the bus. That was like a huge attraction. I'll let you hear about that from him. But one of the things, that it helped us do was have this bigger conversation that, wasn't limited to just the significance of affordable housing as a standalone issue, but we're able to talk about the need to look at issues that impact the low-income community on a global level, and that housing stability significantly impacts whether or not somebody finds themselves caught up in the criminal legal system, whether or not somebody is able to reach their full potential in school, what kind of jobs are available to somebody, and whether or not they're able to reach their potential there. And having these conversations, it didn't happen just with our partners. It happened with the people who are directly impacted and experience these issues themselves, which then enabled us to, work on some of our storytelling and how we understand these issues and present them to, additional partners, legislators, community members, and how we're talking to the impacted community themselves. So I think we did the Charleston event on a Tuesday, and the next day, Wednesday, we had a smaller event right outside of our Appleseed office in Columbia. And the speakers there, we were really excited about. We had our new chairman of Richland County Council. We had the new CEO of the Columbia Housing Authority. We had a former city councilwoman who has made affordable housing one of her priorities for years and years. All of these voices, all of these personalities, incredibly impactful in the Columbia area. But again, we also had some folks out from the surrounding community and people who are directly impacted by these issues themselves. Talked to one of the guys who stays at a local mission a couple blocks over, and who was, very interested to learn about the work that we're doing, where things stand at a federal level, what we're doing at a local level, but also wanted to tell his story about, where he is in his life and what affordable and stable housing could mean to him. So it was just a really productive conversation, and it was the Reverend Malone's bus, using the music that we did, the fact that he is an incredible communicator, just somebody that is easy to listen to, and you could listen to tell stories all day. all of this worked really well to promote a conversation, again, not just with our partners, but with the people who are actually impacted by these issues. So, you know, the quotes and the pictures that you're looking at are all thanks to the work of my colleague, Bach Bam, and also Reverend Malone and his son, Maurice, and Fresh Communities, who were, you know, kind enough to put together not only a PowerPoint with the pictures that you see, but also make sure to get quotes, and their social media posts throughout this thing were awesome. So all in all, you know, it was a big push in a short amount of time, but we feel like it generated a much needed discussion among our partners, among the directly impacted community, and feel that, you know, ultimately it was a win in this space. And I don't think, you know, South Carolina and Georgia get to say that very often. So we are super thankful again to Reverend Malone and Maurice, and to the National Low Income Housing Center, or Coalition, I'm sorry, to have, you know, had the opportunity to do this work together. Look forward to doing more of it in the future. And at this point, I think I'll turn it over to Reverend Malone to talk about how he uses, well, what Fresh Communities does, of course, and how he uses his mobile billboard.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Pharrell Maurice Malone Jr. I am the son of Reverend Malone, and it's a pleasure to be on with you all on today. And thank you, Bridget and Appleseed, for working with us, for partnering with us. I must say, Appleseed knows how to party, y'all. Appleseed knows how to party. So it was awesome working with them and with these events in Charleston and in Columbia. So what Fresh Communities is an acronym. It's facilitating restoration for equitable and sustainable healthy communities. And what we do, we have a holistic approach on trying to just connect people with the services, with the ministries, anything that help the people. So that's where the idea from my dad came with the bus. It's the big bright bus. You can't miss it. Everybody want to go on the bus to see what's on it, but most definitely they see everything that's around it. As you can see in the picture, you see HoUSed right there. We appreciate HoUSed for the opportunity to push the Build Back Better Act and to push this information to our communities. So with the bus, what we normally do on an event or on a tour that we on, we go into the communities, we work with the communities hand in hand, and we come in, we have pretty much a party. It's party with a purpose. And with the party, we bring in services, we bring in anything that's available to the people of that community to help empower them and to help get them on the right track, or to bring services to them as well. So that's why we have the DJ. In Columbia and Charleston, I was actually the DJ. So, you know, we got to know how to party any time. And also we have food. We try to have food at each event, because when there's food, there's always a party. You have food and music, we're going to have a good time. So that's why one of our two main things, that we also try to have different vendors there, like I said, to help motivate and to help get the information out to the people. And we work hand in hand with the community. So a lot of these organizations will attach with us, and because we work hand in hand with the heart. That's our heartbeat. That's our heartbeat with Fresh Communities, is actually getting to them and actually mingling, talking with them. Like we was able to get at a park right down the street from my aunt's elementary school. And we were able to play basketball with the kids at the park. And they have an awesome facility there. They had a big old swimming pool. It's actually indoor and outdoor. And it was awesome to see how the community comes together. It was all demographics coming together in that one community to swim, to play basketball, to get on the playground, and to navigate between one another. And then in Columbia, we had an awesome time as well. It was a smaller crowd, but the information got out. We was able to interact with people walking by. One of the things that we do with Fresh Communities is that we, when cars are passing by, we try to interact with them. We try to get them to come with us, because some people just need a little urge to come by and to talk with us. But one of the a couple of the things that we do is we're working with the grocery stores, try to get healthy, fresh fruits and vegetables into communities. We want to bring the information that you all provided on the call, those numbers, that data, and bring it to the community so they'll be aware of it. We have a lot of town halls when we go into communities. We have different things that help engage them, that help them feel empowered by the time they leave. And also, one of the main things we do is we go back. We love the communities that we go to, and in order to build that relationship, we go back and build that relationship even more. So I want to thank Appleseed. I want to thank HoUSed for working with us, for the opportunity to navigate and partner with you all. And most definitely, we had a great time. And thank you.
Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing your stories, Bridget and Maurice. Maurice, I do have a quick question. How many community members were you able to serve that day?
In Charleston, we probably had a flow of probably about 250 to 300. The community, we was there for about 3 to 4 hours, and we gave out over 200 dinners at that location. And in Columbia, we probably had probably around 100. We had some nice Jamaican food there, so we was able to empower the people that came by, and actually people that was driving by and walking by as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. I think, next time you have a party, you're going to have to invite everyone on this call. We're going to look for our invitation as well.
Hey, you ain't saying nothing but a thing. It's nothing but an email, right?
That's what it is. Exactly.
That's
exactly.
it.
Well, again, thank you for sharing that information. And if you have any links or information about your organization, if you want to drop a link in the chat, that would be great, because I'm sure that folks are really interested in learning more about the work that both of you do. Wonderful. All right. So let's move on. I think at this point, sorry about that. I think at this point, we have reached the end of our session. I don't see any questions that have come in. Actually, there's one question that just came in. And someone wants to know, actually, Sheila wants to know, do you serve vegan food?
Of course. We don't discriminate.
Absolutely. Something for everyone.
No.
All right, thank you again. Thank you again, Pharrell, Maurice, and also thank you, Bridget, for joining us today. And again, that brings us to the close of our call today. We will post the recording of today's webinar to our website. So you can certainly visit our website for more information. The website is www.nlihc.org. You can visit the site for more information, but also look for an email with links that will have a link to the recording and to the material that was shared today. And as you all know, we have calls that are scheduled throughout the week, working group meetings that are scheduled throughout the week. So we will include that information on the email, in the email as well. But tonight we have Tenant Talk Live, which is a webinar that's dedicated to tenant leaders and community leaders. And it's a chance for them to connect, to share best practices, to hear about what's happening at the national level. And then again, what's happening at the community level as well. So that is tonight, this evening at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And there's more information on our website. If you go to our website, there will be a link for folks to register if you're interested in attending. So that's it for today. Thank you so very much for joining today's call, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.